U.S. drone strikes are coming under mounting criticism around the world. Israel is hinting that an attack on Iran's nuclear power plant may be imminent. And with respect to Syria,
the real challenge, though, is to transcend just the political paralysis and the political debate into effective, concrete action that actually does something.
When you hear about international events like these in the news, you ever wish you had access to a group of experts who could break the issues down for you and provide their unvarnished opinions? Well, that's what we're providing. This is the program that brings you expert debate on today's pressing issues of international relations. I'm your host, Michael Scharf. Our expert panel today will be discussing predator drones, humanitarian intervention in Syria, and responding to the threat of nuclear weapons in Iran. First, the news. Welcome back to Foreign Policy Roundtable. I'm Michael Scharf, director of the Cox International Law Center at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Today, our experts will be discussing the controversial use of predator drones, military intervention against the Syrian regime, and the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. Our panel consists of an international negotiator, Dr. Paul Williams, a military expert, Colonel Mike Newton, an ethicist, Dr. Shannon, and an international law professor, Milena Sterio. We'll begin by having each tell us a little bit about their background. First, from our studio affiliate in Washington, D.C., Paul Williams. Welcome to the program, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself for the audience.
Well, by way of introduction, I'm a professor of law at American University here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is a global pro bono law firm, and we advise countries involved in peace negotiations.
And how many of those peace negotiations have you done to date, Paul?
Well, about 24 peace negotiations for PILPG. Some successful, some not so much.
So that's our negotiator. Next, in our Cleveland studio with me, we have Michael Newton, who flew in from Nashville to be with us today. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
And your background?
Let's see. West Point graduate, served more than 21 years in uniform, both in special operations and as a military prosecutor, served in both at the highest levels of both the Clinton and Bush administration State Department, and most recently and relevantly, perhaps, I'm a professor of the practice of law at Vanderbilt University Law School in Nashville, Tennessee. A great place to go to school.
And Mike's joined in studio by Shannon French. Welcome, Shannon.
Well, thanks, Michael. I'm currently the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. My research field is military ethics, and before I came here to the lovely city of Cleveland, I taught for 11 years at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And I'm also a member of a research consortium that's called CETMONS, which is a consortium on emerging technologies, military operations, and national security.
And our final expert is Milena Sterio, who recently appeared with me on WCPN's Sound of Ideas to discuss piracy. It's good to see you again, Milena.
It's good to see you too, Michael.
And your background?
I am currently an associate professor of law at Cleveland State University here in Cleveland, Ohio. I specialize in international law, international human rights law, as well as international criminal law. And before that, I worked as a lawyer at an international law firm in New York City for a number of years.
So we've got the right group of experts with us today, and let's kick off this part of the program by talking about the controversial issue of predator drones. You know, for some, these high-tech weapons might conjure images of the Terminator movies where menacing robots battled against humans. Mike, why don't you start by telling us what a predator drone really is?
Well, the first part of your setup, I think, is correct. These are war-making machines that are designed to fly over very long distances. They don't rest, and so there's two basic functions. One is surveillance. You can have on-site surveillance for extended periods of time over a precise target. And then obviously the second that's been in the news is the targeting dimension. Not all drones target, but many do, and they bring a capability that is hard to match in other ways.
And so how many drones would you say the U.S. possesses at this time?
Well, the absolute number is classified. There are public reports of about 5,000 in the inventory that are split between a variety of different purposes and a variety of different authorities.
And then who controls them? Is it the Air Force, the CIA, the military?
Well, the Air Force has a whole branch of people who train, and then what I call the care and feeding is primarily an Air Force function, so maintenance issues and the uplinks of intelligence and those kinds of things. And then there have been indications in the press and recent strikes, of course, of CIA involvement with a heavy CIA fleet as well that mostly does targeting and obviously some surveillance as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned the press reports. Where is it reported that we've been using these drones?
Primarily, lots of reports recently in Pakistan. The most visible, perhaps, from the Iranian influence was a surveillance drone that the Iranians were proudly displaying on worldwide television. But Yemen has been some press reports, and then I think it's fair to say any number of other classified locations that we don't have public press reports about.
So I assume if it's classified, we're not getting the host country's permission to fly over and use the drones. Is that correct?
Many times not, but I think it's fair to say that we may in some cases have either back-channel express or implicit understanding from the host government.
You mentioned that the drones never sleep. What are the advantages of using the drones over other means of fighting?
Well, the fact is that you have long-term sustainability over a precise place, for example, when you're trying to target the movements and the locations of somebody like Osama bin Laden. It's great to have that on-station presence. Back in the old days, we had to wait for the Earth to turn to have a satellite view, and it was cumbersome and it was problematic. We've solved that problem with drones, provided that you have forward bases that you can fuel and provide maintenance and provide the uplinks, etc. So that's the primary thing. And then the other thing is that you can reach out. You don't require kinetic force on the ground. You can reach out with lethal force in places that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get in ground forces. Even a very small special operations team would have difficulty getting into some of those locations. And so you can do that with drones and extend your reach.
Let's bring Shannon into the conversation. Your particular expertise, as you just described, is in the area of ethics of high-tech weaponry. Mm-hmm. Why do some people find that these drones that seem so effective, as Mike just described them, are actually so troubling?
Well, there's actually a number of issues, but I think the general one has to do with the fact that it's making war feel more like a video game. And the sense is the more it is like a video game, the more we are dehumanizing our enemies. There's a concern that if you don't put skin in the game, if you're not putting your own troops at risk, then you lose the sense of the moral weight of what you're doing. It makes war too easy. It makes it a little too fast as a choice on the many things that people might choose among as a response. So that concerns people.
And what about on the other side? So if you're a Pakistani or an Afghan and you're used to the noble facing your enemy face to face, does the drone somehow make the United States less noble?
Well, of course it does. I mean, if you can imagine being on the ground either as someone who is a combatant or someone who is a civilian and having these lethal robots essentially fly overhead and rain down death, the experience of that is going to make you feel that maybe these folks, are somehow supernatural, not literally, but they have that sense of how do I fight this, and that just rises the anger level to another degree. And then you also have the sense that is there cowardice here? You're not letting me fight back at you. You're just dropping your bombs from this incredibly safe distance. I want to add something here, Michael, that I don't know gets enough attention, and that is the fact that we don't know yet fully the effect of having troops back here in the U.S. using things like Predators and having to switch back and forth from their normal civilian-type lives to this kind of killing. Someone could be killing someone in Pakistan and then running out the door, jumping in their car, and driving to their kid's soccer game. We don't yet know what that does to our own troops. And as you mentioned, we do know it affects our hearts and minds strategy at the other end.
And I assume it's not just our own troops, but the other regular pilots who are looking at their colleagues that are just drone disc jockeys or drone jockeys, I guess, who are safe behind enemy lines. And how do they feel about the use of drones?
Well, there's a sense that it interferes with an entire culture, that you have the culture of the pilot. I used to be able to tell when I was at the Naval Academy which of my students wanted to be pilots. There was a certain attitude, a certain swagger, and that is not necessarily the same type of person you would have as someone manning these the equipment for these drones, the joystick basically for these drones. And so you've got a clash of cultures that isn't necessarily going to always respect one another.
Yeah, this is Mike. Let me interject on that because I think it's critically important to understand that the way you bridge that gap, this idea surfaces a lot, that, oh, these are just video games. These are just guys. No, these are trained professional pilots that in many other ways are the absolute epitome of Air Force professionalism. So the fighter jock mentality that you refer to, I think it's very resident there. And then there's this odd, almost incongruous thing of a guy wearing his flight suit with his combat patch, in the commissary picking his kids up from soccer. That does happen. So what's the check in that system, I think is critically important to understand, is the absolute professional ethos, that the warfighter mentality that says, I'm a professional. And as a professional, I have particularized very rigid rules of conduct and rules of expectations and both legal and ethical dimensions to how I do it. And it's not a video game. I think in some ways, some of the people that I've talked to that do this have erred on the other side of being so conscious of that line that in some cases they have hesitated. And the nice thing about drones is it's not a one-shot deal, right? No pun intended. You can not take a particular target and then take your time to go back to the legal ethical framework, to go back to the targeting methodology and take that same target at another time and another place when it's perhaps more appropriate or more lawful.
Yeah, well, what you're saying, Mike, may well be true, but a lot of this is about perceptions. And I note that you can actually watch a real video of drone-targeted killings on YouTube now. And so let me bring Paul into this discussion. Paul, you've negotiated peace agreements with a dozen countries. From your perspective as a peace negotiator, do you think the expanding use of drones may make it harder for America to win hearts and minds in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan and in Iraq?
Well, look, Michael, I think we have to be honest with ourselves here. The approach, the strategy of hearts and minds, it didn't work in Iraq. It's failing in Afghanistan, and it's certainly not going to work in Pakistan. And quite frankly, I think we've shifted our methodology from hearts and minds to a scare and kill the bad guys. And the drones are just a symptom of this fundamental shift. They allow it to happen, and they allow us to be very effective at the scare and kill approach.
Okay, so we heard Mike mention earlier that the drones are sometimes controlled by the CIA and not the regular armed services. And I understand that critics of the CIA are saying that having the CIA operate the drones creates an accountability void. Is that something, Paul, that we should be concerned about?
No, I don't think we should be concerned about that. The same law applies to the CIA as it does to the other armed forces. There's this notion that you pick up from the movies of the rogue agency. No, we shouldn't worry about the CIA. We should worry about the American people. The reality is that the Americans now are willing, for whatever reason, to accept more civilian casualties, more quote-unquote collateral damage in order to kill the bad guys. Now, on one hand, this actually makes it easier to kill the bad guys. There's a lot less to worry about in terms of moral outrage. On the other hand, it erodes our moral core, both as Americans and as human beings, and that's kind of worrying.
Yeah. Well, Paul, you said that the CIA plays by the same rules. I don't know how we would know that definitively, but we do know that when it came to Guantanamo Bay, there was concern that the CIA had a law-free zone created, that they weren't playing by the same rules. Milena, what's your take on that?
First of all, let me just respond to something that Paul and I think Mike had raised too. Clearly, it's sort of in our interest to go after the bad guys, to scare them, to kill them if we feel like they are threatening our national security interests. But from my perspective as a professor of international law, I do think that there are serious concerns with the use of drones under international law. I mean, to justify our current policy of using drones in the way that we're using them, you have to make a certain number of assumptions, and you have to believe in that every single one of those assumptions is true. So you have to believe that 9/11 was an act of war. We're at a global war of terror. We are, all these targets are enemy combatants. The battlefield moves with them, so wherever they are, you can target them. And every single one of those assumptions is questionable. So I do worry about our own, sort of aggressive policy and compliance with international law.
Well, I think this debate is going to continue on the national scene since the Obama administration is committed to rapidly increasing the number of drones. It's time for us, however, to take a short break. When we return, we're going to be discussing the issue of intervention to halt atrocities in Syria. Stay with us. Welcome back to Foreign Policy Roundtable on WCPN 90.3. I'm Michael Scharf, and I'm joined by Michael Newton of Vanderbilt, Shannon French of the Inamori Center, Milena Sterio of Cleveland State University, and in D.C. we have Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group. We've been discussing the pros and cons of predator drones. In our second segment today, we'll debate humanitarian intervention to stop the killing in Syria. In March, the Arab Spring protests spread to Syria. Just as Muammar Gaddafi did in Libya, the Assad regime has used deadly military force against the Syrian protest movement, resulting in over 5,000 deaths so far, and that figure seems to be rising every day. Shannon, let's start with you. What's the situation on the ground in Syria right now?
Well, the broad answer is violent and unstable. The kind of language that we hear coming out of Syria is chaotic. It has to do with these clashes between the government troops and the rebels, and that happens in the capital city, in the suburbs, in some of the southern villages. And we get more and more reports of death. There is an ebb and flow to it. Sometimes it seems to dial back a little, but it doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon.
And who are the protesters?
Well, it's interesting. On the one hand, there actually hasn't been an attempt to organize a political opposition. There's something called the Syrian National Council, and that includes representatives from the Damascus Declaration Group, which is a pro-democracy network, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which is a banned Islamic political party, various Kurdish factions, and local coordination committees. But the majority of people protesting in the streets appear to be unemployed youth.
And why should we care about what Assad is doing to the unemployed youth in Syria?
Well, I'm an ethicist, so I think we ought to care simply because the protesters are fellow human beings whose rights are being violated. So that's enough right there. And they are demanding freedom and democracy, which are values we claim to share. But if a more pragmatic reason is required, recent and current governments of Syria have been obstacles to peace in the region. Now, do we know if a new government would be any better? We don't know that. It's a roll of the dice. And I certainly myself would not support an Iraq-type intervention. But I don't know, something more like what we did in Libya, perhaps I'd need to hear more about the options.
And the death toll here is actually greater than what happened in Libya. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's unfortunately continuing to climb.
So, Paul, what are the options that are currently being considered for responding to this crisis?
Well, Michael, there's a whole array of options. If you're the Russians, you're considering selling them more weapons so that Assad can do this even quicker and carry out more atrocities against his own people. If you're the Arab League, fortunately, they've become very aggressive lately, and they're seeking regime transition. They'd like to see Assad step aside and have one of his deputies take his position and transform the regime. Turkey, more aggressive, calling for humanitarian zones. And then even have a few countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia out and out calling for regime change. So I think there's a lot on the table. It's very eclectic and it's very disorganized, but I think the international community is beginning to coalesce around some serious action and maybe even humanitarian intervention.
So the situation is very similar to what it was this summer looking at Libya. Why does Russia say, however, that in this case it will veto at the Security Council any proposal to authorize humanitarian intervention in Syria?
Well, Russia has Syria as a client state. We can talk about, whether they were surprised by what happened in Libya. They can talk about international law. The reality is the Russians have a relationship with Syria, a very lucrative arms trade with Syria, and it suits their interest to have an element which is destabilizing the Middle East, which in large part is an American and a European area of significant interest.
And so at the Security Council last summer, when they passed a resolution that authorized the NATO forces to bomb and to assist in the Libya situation, the Russians are now saying that they felt deceived. They said that they didn't think the Security Council resolution went that far, that it was designed to protect Libyan civilians, and it was morphed somehow by the West into a bombing campaign that led to regime change. So, Milena, what's the story behind that?
Well, I do think that there's an element of the Russian, sentiment that they were being deceived that is true in the sense that the Security Council resolution regarding Libya, I think, was purposely vague. It was drafted, to say that we're going there to protect civilians, and who knows where, that could lead. On the other hand, I just want to point out, too, there are a number of other areas in the world. Shannon mentioned this concern about, fellow human beings being, slaughtered or their human rights being not being respected. There are a number of other areas in the world, like Syria, where there are significant violations taking place where nobody's really talking about it. So, for example, Uzbekistan is one of those areas. Uzbekistan for the United States tends to be a strategic area. We go through there to send our supplies to Afghanistan. We kind of need Uzbekistan on our side. There's also Bahrain, where significant human rights violations took place last summer or last spring, and we haven't really seen much involvement. That being said, I do think that there is now a serious situation in Syria. I do think that I would support, Shannon's proposal for some kind of a humanitarian type intervention.
And I'd just like to say, Michael, that I certainly agree with Milena, and I feel that even though our humanitarian intervention policy in the past has not been consistent and probably won't be consistent, that in of itself should not be used as an argument for not intervening. I mean, the fact that we don't intervene everywhere we perhaps should or could often gets raised as if that's an argument for not intervening here, and that really troubles me. Even if you can't do everything, you should still do something where you can.
So let's assume the American policymakers agree with you, and they'd like to intervene, but the Russians are threatening a veto. Let me turn to Mike and ask, does international law allow humanitarian intervention if it's not approved by the Security Council?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. You should tell me. In fact, there's very few instances in history of what I call pure humanitarian interventions that are always commingled with political circumstances and refugees and economic ties and a whole variety of other circumstances. So to ask that simple question, in one way, is a sort of a false assumption that there's a purely humanitarian basis, and we're past that. I would say I think we're in the age of YouTube and Twitter, right? So Saddam slaughters thousands of Kurds in the fall of 1998, and it's very possible for the world to say, well, we didn't really know in time. We weren't positioned to take action. We've seen that change so that we did take action in Kosovo because of very clear, timely information from on-the-ground, credible reporters and in this case, U.S. diplomats. I was there. So we took action in Kosovo, which was the first clear example where we had, after the fact, de facto recognition by the Security Council. So the short answer to your question is it's an open issue against this entire backdrop of very strong, very clear human rights law and what we call crimes against humanity law that says these things are criminal. These are the most serious crimes, the most serious violations in the world. So we got to do something about it.
Paul, Mike mentioned the 1999 NATO bombing campaign to halt the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. You've written about this. I know that the 1999 intervention was not authorized by the Security Council. Russia was threatening a veto back then as well. Was that bombing campaign seen as lawful or legitimate?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities between what happened in Kosovo and what's happening in Syria at the moment. The first step was to find ways through the Security Council, through the General Assembly, to wrap it up in a legal bow. But in both cases, the simple reality was and is that humanitarian intervention is inevitable. We all knew what Milosevic was going to do in Kosovo. He was going to, do bad things. We know what Assad is going to do in Syria. We're trying to put it in a legal context through the United Nations. But if that doesn't work, there are players out there, if it's humanitarian safe zones, if it's arming the Free Syrian Army, there will be humanitarian intervention to stop this. As Mike says, in the context of YouTube and basically instantaneous information about these atrocities, fortunately, I think the ethical core of the international community is still there and won't allow it to happen. The sooner they get in and stop it, the better.
Milena, if we do see humanitarian intervention without Security Council authorization and there is condemnation by the international community, what's the effect?
Well, the effect, I mean, I agree. First of all, I agree with Paul that the situation here is very similar to the one in Kosovo. The difference being, obviously, that now Syria is farther from the NATO zone of influence, so it's very unlikely that NATO is now somehow going to get involved. I think one possible outcome from the perspective of international law is to say these kinds of things, even though at the time they may be viewed as violations of international law, they actually serve to create new norms of international law. So we see the development of a customary norm of international law, which is this paradigm of humanitarian intervention.
And well, now I sound like the cynic, but I want to say if it turns out well, then that public opinion shifts, and as you say, the law adapts. If it turns out poorly, then they say, see, we told you so, and we were against it.
Well, and after the Kosovo intervention, the countries of the world got together and came up with some new doctrine that they called the responsibility to protect. There's a bumper sticker, R2P, they call it. The Security Council and the General Assembly endorsed that doctrine. Would that doctrine apply to this situation? What are the requirements of that doctrine?
I think that doctrine actually, would apply to this kind of a situation. It basically, in a nutshell, says in this kind of a situation where, in a sense, there's a sovereign, but that sovereign doesn't play by the rules, the same way that maybe Milosevic didn't play by the rules or that Assad doesn't play by the rules, then the other states have a responsibility to protect the citizens of that state. And on the one hand, it goes against this, very supreme norm of territorial integrity and the respect for sovereignty of other states. But on the other hand, we say now that you violated those sovereignty rules, in a sense, you don't get to be a sovereign any longer.
Well, that's important because I think what Milena points out is the changing priority of international norms. Sovereignty, really since World War II, has not been the dominant narrative of international law. It's been supplemented in so many other ways by human rights norms, by international criminal norms, by this R2P doctrine. The real challenge, though, is to transcend just the political paralysis and the political debate into effective, concrete action that actually does something.
Shannon?
Well, can I point out the connection to the last topic we went over about drones? In that case, the argument had to do with, well, yes, we can use drones even if they're violating the sovereignty of another country in order to achieve our aims. Here, where some folks might be trying to use sovereignty as an excuse not to do something that has ethical weight behind it. So, I think we can call people on that and say you can't use sovereignty as a cover just because you don't want to do something and yet dismiss it completely when you do want to do something.
Well, let's turn then from the legal question to the practical question, and I'll ask Mike this. From a military standpoint, what would be the challenges of a successful intervention into Syria, and how is it different than our recent experience with Libya?
Well, there's two sort of fundamental things that come to mind when you ask that. One is that there's a very, very long debate, not only in U.S. military circles, but in worldwide military circles, about the balance between pure air power, whether they be drones or stealth bombers or any other approach, pure air power and ground power. There was a long line of development that says, well, we can use overwhelming force and achieve this only through the air. As an Army guy, I would tell you that's wrong. And it's been proven wrong in every context, most recently Libya, right? Imagine Libya with just NATO air cover and no on-the-ground people. In Afghanistan, we conquered northern Afghanistan with very small teams of international operators and a whole range of allies on the ground. So that's the first problem, is you have to have an integrated air-ground campaign, which then raises the second real problem in that particular context, which is that you don't have any viable, at least conceivable right now, mechanisms for moving in large troops, for supporting them, for really seizing control. As Paul said, even if you want to set up a safe haven, a safe zone, that requires on-the-ground perimeters of troops to protect that. And even if they're not our troops, they're allies that we're supplying, that we're equipping, that we're rearming, that we're training in some cases. So that's a real fundamental problem. How do you have a viable, effective ground presence that respects the rule? Remember, the whole point is that we've got a concrete force that respects the rule of law, that implements the laws and customs of war appropriately. That takes a big effort on the ground, and we're just not their position to do that.
So as difficult as it might be, it's possible that there's still going to be action on the ground. Let me go back to Paul and ask you, what do you think the likelihood is that the intervention might lead to all sorts of grim outcomes, a stalemate, regional conflict, de facto partition, sectarian cleansing?
Well, Michael, those of us who are arguing for or who are in favor of humanitarian intervention, we have to be candid. Any change in Syria is going to be destabilizing. That's simply a fact. When you're trying to topple an authoritarian dictatorial regime and place it with democracy, that's going to be difficult. It's going to be complicated. We've seen that in Libya. Here in Syria, we have the fact that there are serious strategic interests for Iran in Syria. The Hezbollah has very serious interest in Syria. You have large minority communities, the Alawites, the Druze, the Shia, and they are going to fear for their security under changed circumstances. So I don't think we can be naive about a humanitarian intervention is going to lead to a flowering democracy. But the alternative is a totalitarian regime that continues to literally oppress and kill its own people.
Mike, you want to add to that?
Well, I think Paul raises an excellent set of points, and this goes back to what I said about a pure humanitarian intervention. In the context of Syria, I think it's fair to say it can't be cauterized. You can't contain it. Shannon pointed out there are implications for the larger regional peace process. There are implications for Hezbollah. There are implications for all kinds of Iranian influence. In fact, I can hear the cynics out there saying, well, this is all just a cover to go fight a proxy war with Iran. You have to be clear that there are a whole range of consequences, and we can plan for those. We can foresee them to the extent possible. But this is not just a pure, simple, moral, ethical, legal issue that we can neatly categorize and neatly contain. It's incredibly complicated, and if we know nothing, we know that we're going to find a lot of consequences that we cannot plan for.
Shannon?
Well, the recent historical context, I think, is so relevant because people are scarred from what happened in Iraq and the sense, fair or not, that we didn't do a good job of anticipating what was going to happen next. And after that had so much harm follow on from having to scramble to figure out, well, how do we respond to what actually has occurred? So I think there's a real fear out there. And frankly, it reminds me of after the Somalia intervention and the problems that occurred there. For a long time, we were shy to do anything similar. And some people even blame the inability of the international community to help in Rwanda on that.
Milena?
So just to come back to Paul's original point about sort of being candid about what we can do in a humanitarian intervention, I do think, though, that it's relevant that to have some kind of an end goal in mind. In other words, I mean, yes, in the short term, we're going there to stop violence against civilians, but in the longer term, and maybe not over 20 years, but sort of over the next 2-3 years, what are we trying to achieve? And Shannon brings out an excellent point about all these other places, Afghanistan also being one of them. Now we're withdrawing from Afghanistan, and who knows what's going to happen. Egypt, where Mubarak was toppled, and now we have basically renewed violence. The revolution is ongoing. Libya is basically a mess. So I do think that we have to have some end goal, not necessarily end goal, but a longer-term goal in mind.
And while we're thinking about intervention in Syria, we've got this looming problem of a nuclearized Iran, which might also need a military approach. And you're suggesting that our means are limited. So let's take this opportunity to take another break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the international threat from nuclear weapons in Iran. We're back with Foreign Policy Roundtable. This is Michael Scharf with Mike Newton, Shannon French, Milena Sterio, and Paul Williams. We've been debating the use of predator drones and how to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Syria. In our final segment today, our expert panel will discuss the options for countering the threat of nuclear weapons in Iran. A recent headline of a major U.S. newspaper declared, quote, August surprise? Iran could have fuel for the bomb before U.S. elections, study says. Shannon, let's begin with you. Iran insists that its uranium enrichment program is aimed at producing civilian power only. Why does the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United States believe that Iran is using the uranium to start to build nuclear bombs?
Okay, well, this is for the Star Trek fans out there. Damn it, Jim, I'm a philosopher, not a physicist. I don't know. I am not an expert. I can't explain it in technical terms, but I gather it has to do with the way they're enriching this particular uranium. There are different uses and they require different enrichment levels. And I gather that Iran's uranium is being enriched to 20% purity, and that is the quality or the level of quality required for nuclear weapons.
So is there any chance that this will be like Iraq was in 2003, where the U.S. intelligence and the UN mistakenly concluded that Iraq had obtained yellow cake and was building nuclear bombs?
Well, I don't know, but if it is, the reaction to that is going to be magnified by the comparisons to the past. And I think the fallout from that would be tremendous.
Paul, let's go to Washington and bring you into the conversation. What do you think the geopolitical effect in the Middle East would be if Iran got nuclear weapons?
Well, I think it would be very, very destabilizing. I think it's important to understand how we got to this point. I think diplomatically, the Americans and our allies have essentially gone out, dug a big hole in the sand, and stuck our heads into it. We've tried to convince ourselves that if we could just delay the acquisition of a nuclear weapon by Iran, that there might be some regime change. And we fail to understand the fundamental drive for the Iranians for a nuclear weapon. It's not Ahmadinejad's bomb. It's the Iranian political entity that seeks to have an atomic weapon for political leverage, for sovereignty, and because they've seen what having a weapon does in terms of the North Koreans in Pakistan, and they've seen what not having a weapon does in terms of Libya.
Now, Paul,
it's going to be very destabilizing.
Paul, the North Koreans claim that they got the nuclear bomb because they wanted to protect themselves from a U.S. invasion, that if Iraq had had the nuclear bomb, it would not have been invaded in 2003. That was their argument.
Yeah, the nuclear umbrella, right?
Is that what Iran is looking at, or is Iran trying to take its power and project it throughout the region by having this nuclear threat?
Think about the current situation of Iran. It sees itself as deserving of a seat at the international table. It doesn't have that seat. Saudi Arabia has that seat. Saudi Arabia is its long-term protagonist in the region, and essentially the Iranians have been shunted aside, and they're thinking they need to protect their sovereignty, they want to be at the table making the important decisions, and they want to replace Saudi Arabia as the major player in that region. You can't do it with the Americans protecting the Saudis, so you need a weapon in order to basically protect their geopolitical interests.
Mike, do you think that Israel or the United States should be afraid that if they had the bomb, they would use it?
Well, let me backtrack 10 seconds and agree with Paul. What we're really talking about is, and this gets often overlooked, is a Persian-Arab schism. And not just the religious schisms and the regional schisms, but you know, Secretary of State Clinton said this is a game changer precisely because the stated purpose is to take this weapon and use it against Israel. So yeah, it's a game changer, right? There's a clear denial of the right of Israel to exist as a nation state. So yeah, Paul's right. This is a huge regional source of instability, and it is a game changer, especially, you know, it's very difficult for us from this side of the water these are intellectual issues to us. To the Israelis, these are visceral, emotive issues. This is truly an existential threat to them in a way that we have not experienced in our culture.
Well, Mike, speaking of Israel, its defense minister, Ehud Barak, recently hinted that Israel is ready to attack Iran's nuclear reactors, saying that while Israel would rather have a diplomatic solution, quote, all options are on the table. Would such an attack be lawful under international law?
The technical legal answer and I think the ethical answer is it would depend on the imminency and the clear demonstration of a demonstrable threat that's imminent, and then the technical legal language is a proportionate response. But I think Shannon's exactly right to go back in the gestalt of the reason. You know, where have we seen this play before of denial and obfuscation and a regime that exercises deceit in order to achieve its own purposes vis-a-vis the entire Western community with the continued engagement of the Security Council? This is Iraq all over again. We've seen this play, and it didn't turn out so well. But this is different in the sense that's compounded in a way that you didn't have in Iraq, with bellicosity, with express statements about using this weapon, developing this technology in a clear way that threatens the very survival of a neighboring nation in the region. And I think Paul's exactly right. A big part of all this is to aggrandize political influence. So if an attack is directed just to help balance out political influence, that's a problem under international law. If an attack is focused on a clear, imminent, articulable, demonstrable threat, and that attack is proportionate in its response, international law clearly allows Israel or any other state to use the degree of force necessary to eliminate the threat. But Shannon's exactly right. The key is demonstrating that threat.
Well, Milena, we're not acting on a historic vacuum here. Iraq actually had a nuclear reactor called the Osiris nuclear plant that Israel bombed in 1981. What was the world's reaction to that?
That's right, Michael. Back in 1981, Israel at the time, I'm presuming through intelligence reports, decided that Iraq, that had this nuclear reactor, was a threat because, they were obviously going to develop a nuclear weapon. And so Israel sent at the time a squad of planes that then bombed the nuclear reactor, destroyed it, and in the attack, 11 people were also killed. I'm hesitant to say civilians because some people would say they weren't exactly civilians if they were engaged in the production of a nuclear weapon, but by all accounts, there were scientists involved in that project. The international community at the time was swift in condemning Israel. There was a Security Council resolution condemning the attack, asking Israel to pay reparations. There was a UN General Assembly resolution asking for the same thing, and even the International Atomic Energy Agency also condemned Israel. Now, some people would say that was back in 81. Rules have evolved and changed, but I think Mike is correct in pointing out it does hinge on the immediacy of the threat. Sort of how certain are we that Iran is, building these nuclear weapons and that they're going to use them?
Shannon?
Well, I just think that, just war theory makes this distinction between preemption and prevention. And we're all talking about that right here. And it's preemptive war when you really can, as Mike was ably describing, when you can prove that they're about to attack. I mean, the original paradigm for that was the troops are assembled on your border. Can you fire at them right now? Well, yes, you could. That was allowed. But, it's a very different thing when you skip on into this preventative war where you're not sure as clearly that the attack is imminent.
But doesn't it change when the kind of attack is nuclear weapons with total obliteration?
Well, this was the language, right? I mean, we heard the the first sign of attack may be the mushroom cloud, and maybe that was rhetoric that didn't make as much sense in one case, and maybe it does make more sense in this case.
Mike?
I think Milena is exactly right to describe the public political fallout, but don't forget, behind closed doors, there are high fives in foreign ministries all around the world when the Israelis take out an imminent budding nuclear threat in those days. So this all operates against a very complex backdrop of politics and, yes, the law, and, yes, the human rights. And I know some ethicists who would argue, well, wait a minute, it's infinitely better to have a small amount of damage now than waiting until we're dealing with the very real omnipresent risk of mushroom clouds. That's a much more dangerous situation in, say, 5 years or 7 years or however many.
Would you be one of those ethicists?
I'm not sure, because we're also skipping close to the territory of assassination as well, because these same kind of arguments come into play when you say, well, if you could just kill these few very specific people, you could take care of the problem. And there are some practical arguments for that. But I worry about whether we're eroding key principles that we're going to wish we had later on.
Paul,
Well,
what's your
Michael,
take on this?
I think one of those key principles that we've eroded is deterrence. We're all here talking about, is there going to be an attack against the Iranian nuclear facilities? And in part because I think we got on this diplomatic path of negotiate. And we skipped over the path of serious deterrence. There was an opportunity early on after the changed circumstances in Iraq where the Iranians were anxious about what our military capabilities and our intentions were. And even now, we're talking about the use of force, but we're not putting ourselves in a strong deterrent position, both with economic sanctions. We've come to them, but very timidly and very tardy. We haven't positioned our Air Force assets in assertive positions around that might be a credible deterrence. And I'm a little worried that we've been caught off guard yet again.
Although we are using the Dolphins, I understand.
Well, it's not only the Dolphins.
I don't think that scares the Iranians too much.
And isn't it also true that we've put computer bugs that have destroyed their or set them back, and also apparently there have been assassinations of their nuclear scientists?
But that's the whole concern is it's this piecemeal. If we can just slow it down, there needs to be a strong. If we're going to avoid the actual use of force, there has to be a strong signal of deterrence. It's sort of a catch-22, but you want to position yourself to use serious force so that you don't have to. We haven't positioned ourselves that way. We've messed around with software bugs, and then, as you guys indicated, presumably targeted assassinations, which isn't necessarily a better alternative to serious deterrence.
I mean, while I agree with Paul that deterrence is necessary, but I think deterrence is useful if we have decided ahead of time that the use of force would be lawful. And I share Shannon's concerns about, have we reached that point? Yes, Iran is a serious threat, but presumably there are other places in the world that are also serious threats, and we do have to respect the rule of law. And anytime we engage in these kinds of preventive strikes, we may be crossing that line, and it's a slippery slope. So I do think that deterrence is important, but I think that determination that we are ready to use force if necessary, and we think it's legal, I think that's extremely important here.
Now, Milena, before when you were describing the earlier Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, you described it as being sort of way out in the desert. Only 11 scientists were killed. It was something that could have been done with a lot of precision, and there weren't many deaths. On the other hand, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has recently said that even the most sophisticated U.S. bunker buster bombs aren't powerful enough to penetrate all of Iran's defenses. And Israel's Vice Premier Moshe Yaalon just very recently said that Israel believed that Iran's nuclear weapon installations are vulnerable to military strikes. Let's go to our military expert, Mike. What's the correct analysis here?
Well, I tend to follow the military professionals, but I think by the time we get to the core questions about military expertise and military capabilities, you got to take a step back. What the military is going to want, if in fact there is military action here, is a clear mission, a definitive end state that they can plan against. What they don't want is to display the kind of strategic naivety that we've displayed to say to the military, go do this, and then anything else that comes along after the fact, we're going to also task to you because we're going to presume that you're capable. And that is a recipe for ultimate strategic disaster. I do think, to tack on to Milena's point, that we missed a critical strategic window back in several years ago when there was popular outcry from the Iranian people that might have achieved regime change in a non-military way, in a completely legitimate way of people rising up and saying, I want human dignity, I want my human rights preserved from an oppressive regime. Oh, by the way, regime change that might or might not have changed the situation. We sat silently by. So the military looks at that and says, that's all ancient history. The military says, give us a clear-cut mission, and we'll do our very best to plan for it. And in military parlance, we won't lose.
Yeah, well,
and if one thing doesn't work, we will try something else until we accomplish the mission. I think that's the mindset going in.
Apparently, while we were sitting silently by, the Iranians were not so quiet. They were digging this new nuclear processing plant way underground, and they were burying it under a major population center.
Yeah.
So this does seem to be a different kind of military operation than the Israelis took 20 years ago. If they have to attack and kill a whole city, or if they have to use nuclear weapons to penetrate that far underground, how is that going to change the equation? Milena?
Well, and now you're getting into the heart of international humanitarian law, the rules that apply to the way you can fight a war. And I think Mike already mentioned this proportionality analysis. You can do things if you think that the military objective you're trying to achieve will not be outweighed by the civilian casualties, non-military casualties that you're going to cause. So if we're calculating, we're trying to figure out if destroying this Iranian nuclear reactor, that's our primary military goal, and that's also going to cause, 3,000 civilians to die, you would have to say, well, is the fact that we're going to now destroy the reactor, does that outweigh the civilian death? And that's a very complex calculus, and I do think that policymakers in the United States or military commanders, I think that when they perform those kinds of calculations, I think that they're extremely careful and extremely respectful of the rules that we have.
Yeah, this is Mike. Let me just add sort of the law school lesson of the day for our listeners, that all commanders, and particularly NATO commanders and Westernized and especially United States commanders, have the legal obligation, and here's the language from the protocol, to do all means feasible to minimize or eliminate the kinds of proportionality analysis, the kinds of civilian damage to civilian lives and civilian property. So the point is that there's a huge range of options and a whole variety of decisions, and it's an incredibly complex decision-making process, both the targeting model, but also the alternative models, what's feasible, what's practicable, and then to try to anticipate the collateral consequences, both in terms of damage and destruction, but also to the larger mission. This is why it's very important to give the military an end state that they can plan against.
In this balance that you're talking about, where you're balancing the collateral damage and you're talking about proportionality, it's always in terms of the proportionality to the threat. So in this case, the threat is nuclear Armageddon launched from Iran. Doesn't that mean that this is a kind of case where the military planners, using your calculus, would likely accept broad casualties of the civilian population?
Well, the International Court of Justice, adjudicating exactly that issue, refused to make a categorical bright line rule. And this is why it's so hard. This is why we have radio shows to talk about this, right? That there's no clear-cut bright line rules you put on a 3x5 card. You are allowed to use in international law the necessary amount of force to eliminate the threat. But then once you're into a conflict, the same term, proportionality, has a very, very different meaning. It simply means, as Milena was alluding to, the balance between the military purpose, the military value, and the larger damage to civilian lives or civilian property. It's a very different concept. So the point is that once you've begun conflict, the use of permissible force is not keyed to the direct nature of what you see in front of you. Okay. But we're talking on the front end of that.
So I'm picturing this Israeli attack maybe coming in the summer, many civilians dying, lots of destruction, maybe successfully getting rid of all the Iranian nukes, maybe just setting them back a little bit. What is the likely reaction of the international community? Now, Mike, you suggested earlier that there would be people secretly clapping against Iran in capitals, but Shannon, what do you think would be the public reaction?
Well, it won't be uniform for certain, but I think the key here is another just war term, and that's last resort. And it's going to be whether or not people are persuaded that, in fact, this was at that point of last resort. And the burden is going to be on Israel to prove a counterfactual. They're going to have to prove that if we had not done this worse result would have occurred. And that's an incredibly hard thing to prove without being able to show people, no, this is what would have happened. So I'm skeptical. I think the results would not pass the reasonable person test with everyone internationally.
Well, everybody's going to have to make that decision for themselves, and I think we'll all hold our breath to see how this plays out in a couple of months. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. We've been looking at some really scary issues today, but we hope that we've shed some light where before there was only heated debate. All of us will have a chance to weigh in during this election year. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to our guests, Mike Newton of Vanderbilt Law School, Shannon French of the Inamori Center at Case Western Reserve University, Milena Sterio at Cleveland State, and Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group from Washington, D.C. This is Michael Scharf. Thanks for joining us.
Talking Foreign Policy is a production of Case Western Reserve University and is produced in partnership with 90.3 FM WCPN, ideastream. Questions and comments about the topics discussed on this show, or to suggest future topics, go to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. That's Talking Foreign Policy, all one word, at case.edu.